This is Switzerland, a neutral and tiny country with a population of around 8.7 million people. And you'd probably imagine that in any conflict, this country would be defenseless. But what if I told you that what Switzerland lacks in size, it more than makes up for in strategic planning? And this is what played a crucial role in allowing Switzerland to maintain its independence and neutrality during the Cold War. Although maintaining this sovereignty wasn't as simple as standing aside, Switzerland's survival depended on being ready for anything, and that meant preparing for the worst. So how did this small and neutral nation plan to face the world's superpowers if they came knocking? Well, the answer to that question begins in 1937. The tension in Europe is quite rapidly growing stronger and stronger with each day. Switzerland, being surrounded by Nazi Germany from the north and fascist Italy from the south, is becoming increasingly worried that in case of another world war, their neutrality would make them a primary target for an invasion. And this fear of being squeezed between two superpowers still persisted during the Cold War, with the main perceived threat being the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact. But Switzerland's defense plan really started to take shape in 1939, when General Henri Guisan was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Swiss Armed Forces. And in the break of the Second World War, he had a radically new vision for the country's military doctrine. Guisan proposed that instead of fighting an incoming invasion through conventional means, Switzerland should instead use its geographic position and infrastructure to its advantage. The mountainous terrain of Switzerland is perfect to force an incoming army into valleys where the roads and tunnels were. These valleys could then be used as strategic choke points where small but very concentrated defenses would be placed. This would give the Swiss an advantage against a much larger invader who would ultimately be dependent on supply lines. Although, since Switzerland's border guards and initial defenses simply lacked the material or manpower to maintain such a fight for a prolonged amount of time, they would eventually have to resort to what might have seemed like a pretty counterintuitive plan: blowing up their own borders. Every road, bridge and tunnel could or was already rigged to the brim with explosives. A large mechanized army would find themselves in shock when they realized that every single piece of infrastructure leading into the country had been absolutely obliterated. And in the valuable time that it would take to clear or create new roads, the Swiss army and population would quickly mobilize. But hold on. Take a look at this population density map of Switzerland. As you can see, most people live in the northern part of the country in order to avoid the ginormous Swiss Alps. But in the case of an invasion, these same mountains happen to be a really useful position to escape to and defend yourself from. Enemy forces would have to advance incredibly slowly through snowy and rocky hillsides. And at the same time, the Swiss, being nifty and precise engineers, would dig themselves into mountains where they would position machine guns and cannons, so that the enemy never truly knew where an attack could come from. Just look at this bunker, disguised as a rock for example, or this cannon hidden in a mountain, and finally this artillery camouflaged as a small cottage. From an enemy perspective, you can imagine how this turns into an absolute nightmare. You lack the mobility to effectively move around, you have dwindling supplies since the transport infrastructure has been destroyed, and at the same time you have no clue when or from where an attack against yourself could take place. And because the Swiss were especially trained in the alpine environment, they would be much more used to moving around and dispersing themselves across the country. This would allow them to strike from multiple unpredictable angles at the same time, thus overwhelming a much larger enemy that couldn't adapt as quickly. But although being relatively small, the Swiss army could supposedly at the peak of the Cold War mobilize over 600,000 soldiers. Nearly all able-bodied men had to at one point or another gone through basic military training. And when they were finished, it was still an obligation that they keep their military gear and weapons in their homes. As a result, soldiers could quickly gather at predetermined locations, already carrying their personal equipment, therefore minimizing the time it took to form units and distribute gear. But the truth is that none of this will be possible without the integration between the military and civilian sector. The Swiss Réduit, translated from French as redoubt, was a plan to retreat the whole population to the Alps, where deep and colossal bunker systems would act as mini-cities, including hospitals, command centers, living quarters, and of course storage for food and equipment. These bunkers also had the ability to self-sustain themselves off-grid with electricity and water, since often they had been built with hydroelectric power dams close by. The purpose of this preparation was to ensure that the Swiss population could keep up their resistance and will to fight, which happens to be as, if not even more important, than the country's military strength. When soldiers know they're defending a population that's fully committed to the cause, their sense of duty and resilience increases, allowing a smaller military to fend off a stronger opponent. At this point, said opponent might have gotten tired of fighting the Swiss like a conventional force. And if the same invader had been dragged into a much larger war, which would likely be the case, they might resort to nuclear weapons in order to put an end to the Swiss resistance. But even in this nightmare case scenario, Switzerland still had a last-ditch survival plan. In the 1960s, when the terrifying reality of nuclear weapons began to sink in, the Swiss government implemented multiple laws requiring every building, whether it was residential, public or commercial, to have access to nuclear fallout shelters. Built to extremely high standards, these shelters could protect against the subsequent blast and fallout of a nuclear war. Although what would be left on the surface for the survivors is a completely separate question that the Swiss government never wanted to have to answer. In the end, all of these systems and defenses were meant to work as psychological deterrents more than anything. Even as we've seen in today's world, with the invasion of Ukraine, a strong defense and motivated population can't magically take away the devastating effects that war has on a country. Of course, the Swiss military planners at the time were fully aware of this, but at the same time, as the old saying goes, if you want peace, prepare for war. And even though a lot of the Cold War defenses, like the explosive borders, have been decommissioned or put out of use, the legacy of Switzerland's Cold War defense plan still lives on today.